From the Tualatin Valley Community Television Studios in beautiful green Beaverton, Oregon, we bring you the Conversations with Dr. Don show. Thank you for tuning in. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time of day it is. I'm glad I wish you a good something. For your first-time viewers, Conversations with Dr. Don is an ongoing series of one-hour standalone talk shows where I interview interesting people like most of you out there about who they are as unique, one-of-a-kind individuals and whatever it is that we've decided to talk about tonight. And tonight my guest, again for the third, fourth, or fifth time, who is Professor Dr. Robert F. Schmidt. Thank you, Professor, for coming on again. You're always interesting and delightful, and I get such feedback about what you do and what you talk about, so that's why I had to have you on again. A few words about Professor Schmidt. He's a former Dean of Theological Studies and Professor of International Relations at Concordia University. He has a PhD in Political Science from the University of Washington and 3 master's degrees. 3. He has taught in Nigeria and lectured in Zimbabwe, China, India, Japan, Germany, and Kazakhstan. He currently lectures on the interface of religion and politics. His latest series is on new directions in American foreign policy. Professor has talked to the humanists of Greater Portland a number of times. He presents a series with a particular title, and we always cheer him on and say, bring him back, bring him back, bring him back. We don't have anybody else who's as regular as you are talking to the humanists, and maybe we'll learn something. Thank you again for coming on, Professor. We have a bit of a cheat sheet. I asked the professor to give me a couple of questions or points that I might provoke my thinking in case what he's saying doesn't provoke it enough, so that we can keep going and have this be interesting for the rest of the evening. So let's do a little brief overview of who you are. They've heard this enough, but I'm sure there's some new viewers out there. And say a few more words about who you are. Shall I ask you questions?
Okay.
All right. And you were born where?
I was born in Blue Island, Illinois.
Blue Island, Illinois. And when was that?
And that was a long time ago.
A long time ago. Here it starts. I love you. And a brief aside here. I'm sentimental whenever I see you. Yesterday was the 1-year anniversary of my major surgery where over half of my small intestine was removed. An event that was very traumatic, and I darn near died. And when I was in the VA hospital, I looked up from my bed, and who's there at my bedside but Professor Schmidt? And you came out of your way to come over and cheer me on. And I was looking like you know what, recovering. And I love you and appreciate you for that.
Good.
And I don't know, a few occasions beyond that, I've called you and says, Professor, I need to talk to you about something personal. And you always say, well, go ahead. And at the time, the last time we did this, I didn't think what you said was particularly valuable. But apparently, some weeks later, I thought, apparently what he said was valuable because I'm living it now, so thank you again.
Good.
Wonderful human being, I promise you. And you didn't tell us when you were born. Will you tell us why you were born?
Well, there's all kinds of answers to that. But anyway, I'm a Depression child, born in '35. And my father was a teacher, a poor teacher. And I remember the trucks that used to come with stale bread. And we used to buy stale bread for that. And we always kind of liked stale bread.
We did too.
So those are kind of memories from that era.
Did you sprinkle a little water on it before you put it in the oven to heat it up?
Might have been, but my mom liked raisin bread, and that was always good toasted for some reason or the other.
And it was sweet too.
And it was sweet. It was good.
So is there anything significant about your cultural national heritage that's worth mentioning, or are you plain old American white bread?
Well, no, actually, I come out of a German heritage, and but I guess the telling experience of my life was teaching in Africa, teaching in Nigeria, and Probably my politics got remade there, and certainly the depth of my thinking got remade there. And it was probably out of that African experience that influenced my life more than just my heritage.
African experience. So it changed from what to what, your religious experience?
Well, it wasn't particularly a religious experience, but it was a rethinking of who I am and what life is all about. And certainly when one looks at the equations of, for example, rich people and poor people. And in America, you think, well, the rich are rich because they gained it, and poor, well, what do you do with a whole country of poor people? Mm-hmm. Is it their fault, or is it somebody else's fault? And you begin to rethink what makes life. But then, on the other hand, in Nigeria, with some of the poorest people I've ever seen in my life, I saw some of the happiest people I ever saw in my life. Because
how do you explain that?
Well, I think it has something to do with just the joy of life and the smiles that you get from the people who wave to you and so forth, as if there may be more to life than what one owns. And that, too, was a powerful thing to learn.
And how long were you in Nigeria?
I was in Nigeria for 3 years, and we went back for a second tour, but my wife got ill, and so then we came home.
I bet you've got some stories.
Oh, yeah.
So, and your religious preference today?
I happen to be a Lutheran pastor and a Lutheran theologian, mm-hmm. and that's carried me through and has informed many, many things of my life. Uh-huh. And I probably am still committed to where I am and who I am, probably because I believe in sort of God's love for all people, mm-hmm. and His grace. And so I don't happen to come out of the framework of law and order kind of religion, but more the goodness and graciousness of God.
I've always wanted to ask you this question.
Sure.
Humanists are a bunch of radical atheists and liberals and agnostics, mm-hmm. and the whole shot, and yet we bring you back time after time, and you're a Lutheran pastor. Right. What is it about you that we do this?
hopefully that the fact that I believe that God is good and gracious to all people, including good humanists.
Okay. And Jimmy Mowgli, our guest, the cameraman out there, is also a humanist. So you're outnumbered, Rick. And we talked a little about your education. Why 3 master's degrees, Professor?
Well, basically one finishing a seminary, and when I came back from Nigeria, I had a chance to study basically the theology of mission, and that's the second master's degree. It's called the Masters of Sacred Theology. And then the third master's was in comparative government, and I studied water management in West Pakistan. And so that helped me understand the politics of what's going on in that particular area of the world. And so that then I did a doctorate on top of that.
The politics in that area of the world, that had some influence on your evolving to where you are today and how you look at political and social issues?
To a degree.
Uh-huh.
The more you pick up knowledge about what's happening all over the world, then you try to analyze it, and you try to figure out where are things common, what are the common problems that people face around the world in things like economic development. Now that water is becoming recognized as being a real crisis throughout the world, to have some experience in water management, to know what potable, drinkable water, how rare it is, and how it's going to be necessary for continuing life on the planet. Those are all extremely important issues, and I think that some of my study has given me a background on that.
I saw where you are today and how you look at political and social issues. You talk about you arrived there because of your observation of what went on in your travels and what's going on in the world and the different places you've spent time. And yet, our president apparently has some awareness of those things you're talking about. and yet I'm not sure he has the same outlook on political and social issues that you do. Can you explain that?
Yeah, I think that, first of all, I wouldn't put too much emphasis just on, in quotes, the president, because the foreign policy of the United States has been determined for many, many years by things outside of the president's power, actually. The president isn't as all-powerful as we might think. Harry Truman said, wait till Dwight Eisenhower comes here and he gives an order and nobody obeys. And he says, what's going to happen then? I think what has happened is that foreign policy, of which I am very interested, has evolved, and there are makers of foreign policy which are under the surface, and you don't see them often. But when you take a look at who benefits from military spending, for example, you see corporations, the Boeing Corporation, like General Electric, you'll see General Dynamics, and you see the billions and billions of dollars that they make every year out of an expanded military budget, and you'll have to say, wow, is that all really necessary? And do these corporations, in that way, do they have an inordinate influence on what happens in this country? And, for example, in Latin America, we saw that there was a coup in Honduras.
Yes.
And first the president said, well, he's against the coup, and then American foreign policy dithered and dathered. It didn't really come out strongly for getting Zelaya back into power. But it wasn't only till lately that we found out that what had happened prior to the coup is that he wanted to raise the minimum wage for the people who worked in the fruit industry. And when that happened, that triggered the coup because of United Fruit Company and some other U.S. companies that said, if they do this in Honduras, they're going to do it all throughout Latin America.
Wow.
And so you begin to find out, well, who's behind the foreign policy? Is it really President Obama, or he's busy with something else? Or is it the people who have got the connections with the Honduran military, which might be United Fruit Company, etc.? And so when you see that, you have to ask the question, where does foreign policy really come from? Does it come from the president, or does it come from the powers that be and the ones that have been influencing, for example, the military groups in Latin America, because they go to the School of the Americas? And you begin to see there are whole foreign policy groups in this country that have an inordinate influence on what happens.
So we are not really living according to what the Constitution and the rules of government say.
Well, it certainly would come in that, but the Constitution is fairly quiet on how various people influence the government. And this was thought to be something we could regulate by voting, by Congress, etc. What the constitutional framers didn't figure on, I think, was that certain corporations could have so many lobbyists in Washington and have so much influence in campaign expenditures that they could virtually buy the policies that they were after. And now with the Supreme Court decision saying that corporations are not limited as to how much money they can give to candidates, etc., now the door is even open further for corporate influence on American democracy.
Where are we heading? My goodness, so we're getting into the main body of what we're about. So let me continue with the bio stuff, and we'll go to your cheat sheet.
Okay.
Okay. Do you have a partner? I know you do, but tell the viewing audience about your partner.
Yes, I have a wonderful partner. We just celebrated our 50th wedding anniversary. 50th wedding anniversary. Her name is Karin, and she is from East Prussia in Germany, which is no more, now part of the Kaliningrad Oblast of the Soviet Union, which is a small bit of the Soviet Union on the other side of Lithuania now. It used to be joined to the USSR, but now it is, it was the city of Königsberg, and now it's called Kaliningrad. And this is where the Russians keep many of their submarines in a warm water port on the Baltic.
Is it an independent state?
No, it is not. It is an oblast. It is part of the Soviet Union. It is part of Russia.
Russia. Uh-huh. Do you ever go back there?
No, we have not been back. We've been to Germany a number of times, but not there.
How about children and grandchildren?
2 children. I have. I grew up in sort of academia, and I've been a campus chaplain at Colorado State University and the University of Washington. My kids just grew up with academics, and so they both got doctor's degrees in science. One is a plant physiologist, and my son is an inorganic chemist. He teaches at California State University in San Marcos.
You're not proud of them, are you?
I guess a little bit.
Okay, and any persons from the past or alive today that you admired or look up to? Any names come to mind?
We were just talking about one that you talked to me about, Cornel West.
Yay!
comes out of the faith, and yet is certainly on the cutting edge of what we would call the politics for the people. And Bishop Tutu from South Africa is another hero of mine. And the whole idea of peace and reconciliation between groups, particularly as I think of what's happening in Israel-Palestine. And he basically says, why don't they try a peace and reconciliation commission there between groups from Hamas and the Israelis and see if we can work out some forgiveness between people who have been warred at each other.
Aren't you rather optimistic? I'm
Maybe
betraying
not.
my pessimism.
Well, I'm saying he's one of my heroes. And
Yes.
Wouldn't you have thought in the middle of apartheid that anyone who had thought that there would be any solution to South Africa without a bloodbath would be terribly naive and optimistic? And yet look what happened.
Okay, you got me. Hope springs eternal. Cancel that. What do you think of FDR and what he was about in the Great Depression? Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
The little I know, and that's not an area of my expertise.
Sure.
I think that he did some of the things that were necessary. He tried to do some things. I looked again at trying to pack the Supreme Court after the Supreme Court's current decision of whether that would be possible. And apparently he tried, but then it found out it wasn't necessary. And so he never came to the point of packing it. The Constitution, I guess, doesn't say how many justices there should be. And so the whole question is still open of whether you could pack the Supreme Court. And I'm not sure that that's ever going to happen, simply because of the customs that we have. And the opponents to whoever would try that would scream bloody murder, I'm sure.
I've seen a couple of pieces lately in my emails. Some speculation as to which of our presidents since FDR came closer to having the ideals and the performance of FDR. Was it LBJ or Jack Kennedy or Carter? Any thoughts along those lines?
No, I think maybe I'm going to step back a little more as a political scientist.
Sure.
And say, who we elect as president is not necessarily the thing that's the most important piece of politics we could do. I think a lot of people had great hopes for Obama. And maybe they were carried away by their hopes rather than by evidence. In the United States, nothing ever changes much. The country is designed constitutionally to keep things from ever changing very quickly or very fast. Basically, the separation of powers. The fact that you have usually 2 parties, and those 2 parties are made up of very diverse elements. So then you have federalism, which means state power versus federal power, local power. And so the whole Constitution is designed that nobody's going to be able to sweep the country off its feet and go in a new direction. When you do have significant changes, as we've had with the civil rights movement, the women's movement to vote, some of that oftentimes didn't happen in politics. It happened underneath. It happened with the people. And when the people started doing something, then it finally kind of burst out into the political life. But it maybe starts with Rosa Parks, you know, sitting on a bus. And maybe that's where any real change for good things in America happens, maybe more than the presidents.
Can you picture a Rosa Parks kind of an incident that would do something about the Supreme Court decision, this 5-4 decision?
Not directly. I can see, however, that with the current anger at what people perceive as the giveaway to the corporations, and the fact that some people got huge bonuses while many, many are unemployed and are losing their homes, I see in that a widespread anger at what is really happening. And some of that anger is devoted against politicians in Washington.
With good reason. Oh, no.
Yeah. Well, that maybe even a conservative group of people are against the government. On the other hand, on the other side, are people who can say the only thing that can save us from those rapacious corporations is the government. And then they have to step back and say, but if those corporations have purchased Washington and have purchased the government, then I'm not sure I'm for that kind of government either. And so some people in the left who sort of believe in government power have got to step back now and say, but if the government really isn't in charge, or maybe the corporations have purchased the government, then what?
So the Tea Party is what?
The Tea Party is representing to a certain extent people who don't like government. I mean, that's what, against taxes and so forth. I don't think we know the whole story of the Tea Party.
Sure.
I think there are very, very few instances of people of another race involved in Tea Party. In other words, almost all the Tea Party people I see are white. I think some people believe it to be a racist organization. Other people believe that it's been purchased by big corporations who are anti-government too, even though they're not anti-government in that sense. And so there's a lot of stuff about the Tea Party we really don't know. What I find interesting is that the media keeps focusing on that instead of on many of the other people who are very dissatisfied about the way the country is going, but wouldn't see themselves in that framework at all.
Why do you think the media is focusing on the Tea Party as much as they are?
I don't know, except that I believe the media, the intermediate media, is largely corporation-oriented and corporate media. And as you and I know, because we exchange a lot of emails on news that doesn't make it into the news, I think that we begin to see that there is a certain kind of systemic conspiracy against informing the American people of a lot of things.
That's a pretty strong statement you just made.
And a systemic conspiracy is not necessarily a planned conspiracy.
Yes, yes.
It's not necessarily that people are saying, let's do it this way. It's rather the fact that where do you get the money to put on a broadcast? Where you get it from advertising. Where does the advertising come from? Who owns the media? You'd be interested to know that, for example, NBC is owned by General Electric. And during the Olympics, you see all the General Electric ads and so forth. And you hear, well, NBC may be having problems with their programming, and yet their profits were higher than any other news media corporation anywhere. GE makes a lot of military weaponry. And so would GE and NBC feature a lot of protests against the war, or would you feature them with military stories? And GE makes jet engines for U.S. military planes. And so when you start putting all that stuff together, you say, well, are we really getting the kind of news that we need to be able to make good democratic decisions? And so I think we need to open up the doors to find out news from other sources.
How about opening the doors? How do we open up the doors?
That's a good question, and I don't know all the ramifications of it, but I do know that as people exchange news not just of opinion, but a fact. And just ran across some new avenues for myself. I subscribe to the Guardian and
I love the Guardian.
and look at the Guardian news, Democracy Now, the Yes magazine, the Real News.
Listen to the citations he's making and Google and look at what he's talking about for some real news.
Right. And so when you begin to cull from all of these sources, I thought, wouldn't it be a nice letter to write to Diane Sawyer? This is the news you missed today.
That would go over the big. You're making Rick laugh over there.
This is the news you missed today. You missed the news that India and Pakistan have now begun their peace talks again today.
Wow.
Which is they're just kind of talking to talk. But that's a very, very important story. And it was not broadcast in any of the news today. And so you begin to put together other pieces of world news that the American people don't know about. And so the American people are relatively ignorant about what's going on in the world.
Yeah. Well, looks like it's getting close to time for a break. Is it 30 minutes left now? Okay. In a moment, we're going to put up on the screen a few panels that show information that you may want to make note of during the break. You may want to get a pencil and paper now. For you viewers who live in the Washington County part of the Portland, Oregon metro area, Conversations with Dr. Don shows a broadcast 7 times each week. Typically, a new show is first aired on a Tuesday and is rebroadcast on the following Friday through Monday. You can also get Conversations with Dr. Don on the internet. You can tell your friends to watch the shows on the internet anytime by going to my website at www.donbaham.com and clicking on favorite links. Now I want to give you there's the website, a few key Washington, D.C. phone numbers in a minute. If at any time during the rest of the show the thought crosses your mind that you'd like to contact the people in Washington, D.C. who supposedly work for us, the citizens, you can take down the phone numbers that'll also be up on the screen during the break. Call Washington and tell them what you want and don't want them to do. Most of them really do want to hear from you. And we're going to put those panels up on the screen right now and take a couple minutes break, and we'll be back in a little while. Okay, we're back. Thanks for staying tuned. For you viewers who missed the opening of the show, Conversations with Dr. Don, that you're watching is an ongoing series of 1-hour standalone talk shows where I interview interesting people like most of you out there about who they are as unique, one-of-a-kind individuals and whatever it is that we've decided to talk about. So tonight we have Professor Schmidt, who we've had on before, talking about the Peace Project and other related subjects and all sorts of stuff. I just really enjoy visiting with you, and I forget the cameras here at all. So let's get to what we're supposed to be talking about tonight. And we have a question here. Why does America need new directions? Why does America need new directions, Professor?
Needs new directions in foreign policy in particular. In international relations, oftentimes people are divided between those who are idealists and those who are realists. The idealists would like to say, well, let's have peace instead of war. And it oftentimes stays at an ideal framework. The realists are saying, look, this is a dog-eat-dog world, and so you need military power and military strength to defend yourself, to become more secure, and to get what you need to get to bless your people. And so between that idealist position and the realist position, people go back and forth on that. However, now we need what we might call a new realism. A new realism is, it's good to say, well, we need power to strengthen ourselves, etc. But what if, in quotes, you don't have that power? And so a new realist look at American foreign policy in particular says, look, we have troops in 156 different nations.
156 different nations.
We have bases in over 60, and we've just added 3 or 4 in Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and so forth to give us some leverage in Vietnam. Now, when you take a look at troops in so many different places, and we look at the defense budget, which is well over $600 billion, then you begin to understand that the debates we have about health care and other aids to people, we begin to find out they pale in insignificance versus the defense budget. And the defense budget is just kind of, it hasn't gone down at all. In fact, it continues to go up as we fight wars. And then the question is, why did we fight the wars? Did it really aid the American people? Are American people safer now that we're fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan? Or are we actually less secure from terrorism? We saw Christmas, the potential bombing on the plane and so forth. Mm-hmm. So do we spend all that money to be that safe? Or are we, in fact, spending more than we have? Are we really weaker? The new realism says, take a look at America quickly and say, look, we've lost much of our industrial base overseas to overseas countries. We no longer have a monopoly on almost anything. Other people have copied us in nuclear weaponry. They've copied us in submarines. They've copied us in many other things. That when you take a look at our world now, we are no longer a unipower, a unipolar world governed kind of by the United States. We no longer have a bipolar world with the Soviet Union and the United States. Now we have a multipolar world. When one takes a look at China and how big China is, and its wealth, and its increasing navy, its navy getting bigger, its space explorations. You take a look at Russia, which is still next to us, or maybe even more than us, the most heavily armed nuclear power. You take a look at all the Islamic nations and what they are able to do with the oil resources that they have. You take a look at Europe. Europe has just grown bigger than the United States. It has a bigger market. The euro is replacing the dollar in many places around the world. And you say, now look at, this is a multipolar world. The United States is no longer in control. In fact, if you want to ask people a question, would you think about, let's say, we wanted to prohibit Iran from having a nuclear weapon, that we should have a land invasion of Iran? Do you think any of the American people would believe that or want to do that? Or let's say China made some moves against Taiwan. Do you think that the United States would ever invade China with a land force over against the many, many people that China could call up? We are beginning to realize we're no longer the world power. We might be able, with everything in our power, to defeat a moderate-sized country militarily. But to take on 2 or 3 countries at one time, it's no way. Everybody in the world knows that that's not possible, and nobody fears us in that way.
Aren't we behaving as though we are the world's power?
Yeah, we're behaving as if we were the world's policeman.
Yeah.
Something has just happened in Japan, in Okinawa. A person out of power in the Social Democratic Party of Japan has just called for all the Americans to leave Okinawa. And basically said, look, Japan doesn't need that. We don't need American troops. We have between 40 and 50,000 troops in Okinawa right now. Well, when that request was given to the U.S. government, they said, well, you don't understand. We are keeping the peace in Asia.
Keeping the peace
in Asia.
Yeah.
And so now now we have we have a sizable group of troops in Korea as well. So between Korea and Okinawa, if one counts the expense of those troops and the installation, plus the fact that the people there, many of the people don't want us there because we pollute with our Air Force. We have had many, many cases of rape and criminal behavior on the part of U.S. troops. And so we're not really the best friends that they've ever had. And so many people want us out. But why are we there? We're there because we think we are the world's policeman, and we have to keep order in that area. Now, one might ask, well, how would you prevent a war? How would you prevent China from invading Taiwan? How would you prevent North Korea from hurting Japan with one of its missiles? And here, I think we have to back up a little bit and look historically at the situation. Great Britain was faced with some of those same issues in European wars. And Great Britain found out that they tried to do what they called offshore balancing, which meant that if Germany was getting too powerful, we would side with France, side with Austria. You know, you kind of put your weight for the person so that you keep some kind of a balance of power. And I think the United States is powerful enough to do that kind of offshore balancing without necessarily having the troops on the ground and the planes there, that we could kind of pull back a little bit and say, well, there's things that we could do to aid. I think we're going to see a rising problem between India and China. These are 2 huge countries, and they are having some places where their interests do not coincide. And so if China becomes a threat to that part of the world, we might put a little weight and friendship to India.
Isn't this just an example of let's you and him fight, which is the classic behavior of the ruling elite to prevent you and somebody else from threatening my domination? So wouldn't it be interesting for some Tea Party kinds of people to encourage a conflagration between India and China, and that way neither one of them would be a threat to our to the ruling elite's economic interests of our country, and so on. I wonder, that's just pretty Machiavellian, I think.
It's probably, you could call it Machiavellian, but I think that I'm trying to look at how to save a few bucks. And the fact that I believe that the United States is not quite at the bankruptcy point, but we're heading in that direction. And so I think one of the places where you can save money is to cut back on military industrial kinds of stuff.
But if you cut back on military industrial kinds of stuff, then you can't use the military and our military power to enforce our economic ideas and pursue Naomi Klein's shock doctrine theory.
Well, it may mean that we have to reintroduce the whole question of a new industrial policy in the United States. I fear, in some cases, if we were to demilitarize too quickly, we would have even more unemployed people. or if we cut back on military spending in the Boeing Corporation, more people from Boeing are going to get laid off. And so I think that it gradually has to come to a new realization that instead of trying to do everything militarily, we're going to have to maybe adopt a new kind of localism, which says maybe we ought to start making the things that we need and doing the things that we could do. I think it may mean that we're going to have to lower our standard of living. I think that's going to happen inevitably, but I think it would be best if it was done in terms of kind of a steady downward spiral rather than all of a sudden an abrupt thing like's happened recently.
I think lower our standard of living, look at what that really means, and I think that's really significant because those things we're talking about that could happen to our country if we continue in the same direction, the standard of living of the rich and the ruling elite are not going to be affected. So they will continue to pursue the short-term greed to be powerful and have more money and be better than their neighbors, their rich neighbors, at the expense of ordinary citizenry. And what can we do to head off the direction that we're heading in?
Yeah. I think there are things that are being tried all the time, and I think that part of it is to alert the American people to what is happening, and I think that's happening gradually as people are beginning to get suspicious of corporate greed, and I think that inevitably there's going to be some changes. I would love to see it happen peacefully rather than the other way around. But, for example, the idea of taking your money out of the national banks, from Chase Manhattan or Wells Fargo, and putting it into the local credit union, may be an idea whose time has come. We may see some other things.
I've done that.
Yeah, I know a number of people have. And so we're beginning to see a little bit of coming back, beginning to ask real important questions like, what's life all about? Is life all about having the latest and the best and so forth and losing my family in the process? Or is life really finding out that maybe my family and my friends and the things that I love most are most important to me, helping other people who need a helping hand? Maybe that's what life is all about. And when you see that kind of thinking beginning to happen, then I would think that we might find some pathways.
So that we can have a populist uprising, and people cannot have the kind of thinking that you're talking about unless they have enough information to make an informed decision about what's really important. Those things you just mentioned now, decency and kind to each other, were things that much different 40 or 50 years ago as far as the way the average American thought than they do now. It seems like, I'm guessing that the average American, for the most part, is more concerned about protecting themselves and quietly endorsing America's aggressive behavior toward the rest of the world.
I think there's a lot to that, especially because we're in the habit of thinking that way. Ever since, I think, the First World War, although it's probably happened to many other countries in the same way, but American foreign policy has been marked by the demonizing of your enemy. During World War I, Germans were thought to have long teeth, and blood dripping from them, and so that people hated Germans, even though that whole war is rather, we're looking back at it and we're saying, well, I'm not sure it was like that. And then in World War II, you could demonize the Japanese and the Germans.
Yeah.
And then you demonized the people in Vietnam. And then you demonized the people in Iraq. And so you did your foreign policy by seeing somebody as an enemy. And you have to mobilize support in order to do a war in that way. Now all of a sudden, we're thinking if we're going to have to change this. I always like the example of Norway. And Norway's foreign policy is that, well, you have interests. your country has some very important interests, and my country has some very important interests. Let's see if we could sit down and talk about it. Because I know that you're a decent person, and you have concern for your people, and I have certainly concern for my people, and my people are a little spoiled, and they use too much gasoline and stuff like that. But you have to understand that that's where we're at. Now, can we talk about what we're all about? And it's much easier to demonize them, but it's interesting that the Oslo Accords got started in Norway, because the Norwegians could say, well, the Palestinians have a point, and the Israelis have a point. Can we get together and talk about that? And couldn't you also see that happening between us and somebody else?
Aren't the Norwegians among the most contented people on the planet?
Well, they share it with the Swedes and the Danes, maybe the Finns.
How can we change American foreign policy? What can we do? And we, I'm not sure how to describe we. I think, like I think you're saying or implying, that America is being controlled by the corporations and the ruling elite or the super rich or some people behind the scenes. But how can we affect the change in American foreign policy so that America can move in the direction of being what I call KFC, kind, friendly, and loving?
Yeah. I think that it has to happen from the bottom up. We've just formed a little group that's called the People's Peace Project. Now, there are probably 50 to 60 different peace groups in Oregon. I'm not sure we need another one. But we formed it in order to say a couple things. One is that oftentimes a peace group has just get out of war, and that's very valid. But other people say, well, I can't quite buy into that, because what would happen if we got out of this war? What would happen to other aspects of our foreign policy? And so we began to say, well, if you looked at this holistically, that if we took as kind of the basic assumption that America is no longer as powerful as it was or thinks it is,
Okay.
that we use that as a basic assumption, then we could start working in a more humble way to be able to say to other people, are there other ways to bring peace in a variety of places in Latin America? Are there other ways to work with Russia? Are there other ways to bring peace to the Middle East? You and I have talked about a one-state solution to Israel-Palestine.
The only solution as far as I'm concerned.
Are there other ways to work with Africa? Are there other ways to work with failed states and repressive states through the UN or through other regional associations? And so the People's Peace Project has tried to put together most of these issues that arise in American foreign policy. We picked the name People's kind of from Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States. The People's History of the United States, where he begins with the Arawak Indians who got wiped out after Columbus invaded.
Yeah.
And so he was kind of saying that real change doesn't happen in America from top on down, whether we elect the right president or the wrong president. It happens from us. And so we wanted to say, well, as a People's Peace Project, we want to start talking about the whole complicated issues of American foreign policy. And we would like to say, look, American foreign policy has up to this time been made by the military-industrial complex. It's been made by people who do business overseas. But it hasn't talked a lot about people like us who want peace, don't want war, who want to give a fair deal to people, who want Iraq to be able to have the possibilities of negotiating oil contracts with the Chinese or with somebody else. That if we want an oil contract there, we ought to have a better deal for them.
How do we get them to listen to us, people like us that you're talking about, when the corporations own the mainstream media? Is internet going to be sufficient?
I'm not sure internet is going to be sufficient, but I think that as we begin to educate ourselves and educate others, there may be a spark, a Rosa Parks someplace along the line. And someone who says, hey, enough of this. Why should we die for the sake of corporations, and their profits? Why should American young men have to choose between unemployment and death on the battlefield? Isn't there a better way? And as we keep asking that question and informing ourselves about all the aspects of it, I'm a person of hope. And I've seen changes happen in South Africa, in America, and they can happen again.
So they can jail only so many of us, and if we start at the grassroots level and march, I think it's going to take civil disobedience and not cooperating with the system now. That's going to cause those kinds of changes. Radical changes never happen until we shut the system down.
I've been reading a very interesting book. It's a little dated, but it's called The Red Orchestra. Mm-hmm. And the Red Orchestra was the story of how people under the Nazi regime resisted Nazism. Mm-hmm. And basically, the Nazis had taken over almost all of the newspaper and whatever, and nobody could do anything. Nobody could say anything because it had been covered.
Okay.
And so what people did is they had a sticker brigade. And the sticker brigade, they made little stickers, and they put them on signs with truth on them about how Poles were getting killed in Poland, how Jews were being killed. And they had evidence of that, and they were putting stickers on things. Eventually, most of those people, like you would predict, got killed. But in the resistance, they began to find other ways to tell the truth. And it was in that very courageous way that they began to make a change. And they didn't last, but the memory of what they did has lasted. And it may be a sign of how you have to proceed. If some news channels are locked up, we may have to find other ways to communicate with each other. We might even talk to each other.
You're so full of hope. Yeah. Sometimes I think I'm getting pessimistic, but then when I talk to you for a while, I can see it's marvelous to be hopeful and to not just lay down and roll over and give up. So I got this high sign here that we have 5 minutes left. Looks like we've got about 4 left or so. It's close to time to stop. Keep those pens and pencils handy because you may want to jot down something that we'll show you in the closing credits. I invite you to give us feedback, both positive and negative about any aspect of the show, and I mean it. It helps us to give you a better show in the future. A few public service announcements. I want to tell you about the Alliance for Democracy. That's a citizen activist organization. You can put that panel up, the national website. That's the website for the national. We work on political and social issues of importance that resisting the domination of the country by corporate power. And there's your local chapter, the Portland chapter, the phone number and website. And we meet twice a month, and we go to Salem, our state capital, and part of the nuclear resistance. And let me tell you about the ACLU. I'm getting tired, Professor. The American Civil Liberties Union. Without the ACLU, I think we'd be in more trouble as far as our civil liberties are concerned. The ACLU is a wonderful organization. Thank goodness for the ACLU. There's the website. And we want to tell you about the ACLU racial profiling hotline. If you think that you have been stopped by someone because of how you look rather than for a legitimate reason, the ACLU wants to know about it, so that you should call them and let them know if some overeager law enforcement has stopped you for no good reason. I want to tell you about the Humanists of Greater Portland. That's an organization that I belong to. And there's the website for the local chapter of the Humanists of Greater Portland. We meet every Sunday morning at 8:45 and 10 o'clock at Friendly House. No, don't put that one up. That's for August. Thank you. And like regular church folk, and we have a good time talking about things and having speakers like Professor Schmidt keep us informed about what's going on. And before we say goodnight, I want to also thank you, my wonderful crew, and my director for making a good show work for us tonight. I want to thank you viewers in other parts of the country where you're watching. Thank you for watching. If you live in another part of the country and are watching this show, contact your local community TV cable access studio for information about when they're planning to broadcast Dr. Don shows in the future. You can take that panel down, please. Remember KFC, I always end up with my shows with Dr. Don's KFC, not Kentucky Fried Chicken. Kind, friendly, and charitable. Be kind, be friendly, and be charitable to you too. Thanks again for watching, and thank you.